Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David Fringe with Curtis Chang, and we're going to talk midterms today. Now, we're not going to talk midterms from the standpoint of, as my friend Jonah Goldberg says, rank punditry. If you want rank punditry, it is available. The rankest of rank punditry is available at the Dispatch Podcast, our most recent Dispatch Podcast, where Jonah, Sarah, and I talked about the politics of everything for a while. And then also on the Advisory Opinions podcast, Sarah and I talked about the politics of it the day after the election. So if you want all of that, if you want the sort of who's up, who's down, what does this mean politically, I'd refer you there. But we're going to talk about something else. So we're going to talk about what does this mean as sort of a sign of our times at a deeper level? What does this mean through the prism of faith? What does this mean for people of faith who are engaged in politics? And Curtis, you had some thoughts on framing the discussion.
Yeah, and let's just be clear that today's podcast is one of the formats I love the most about our Good Faith podcast is the what I call the point guard format. This is where one of us plays point guard and basically is feeding the other the ball. And we've done that with each other. David, you've done that in the past wonderfully with me, feeding me the ball on the spirituality of anxiety or the theology of institutions. But when it comes to current political events in the world, I am definitely the point guard here, feeding LeBron or KD or whoever the ball here. But I do want, as any good point guard, I have to at times look for my own shot, and I'm going to do it right out of the bat here. And I want to interpret what this means to be called to interpret the signs of the times, like you said, because that's what we're trying to do in this podcast. So that phrase comes from Matthew 16, verses 1-3. And the event is, I'll just read the short passage. It says, verse 1, "And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to Jesus, and to test him, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered them, 'When it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times.'" So Jesus there is setting up a contrast, first of all, between signs from heaven that the Pharisees and Sadducees want to get him to deliver, to test him, versus the signs of the times. So in other words, God doesn't just speak from on high in supernatural ways on demand. Like, God, just show us the way, show us what's happening. That doesn't just happen with miraculous cloud writing in the sky. Okay, that Jesus is saying, look, God also speaks to us through the signs of the times, through events happening in the world. And so that's why Christians are not supposed to just hide their heads, close their eyes to what's happening around them. And this is actually a word, I think, to what we've called the exhausted majority, the two Christians out there who just want to make politics go away and ignore it entirely. No, actually, if you want to attend to God, you actually have to attend also to the signs of the times, not entirely, not obsessively, but it's just a part. It's a part of paying attention to God, is paying attention to the signs of the times. But this paying attention to the signs of the times requires discernment. It requires us how to pick out the right aspects that truly are meant to serve as signs, and that requires discernment and wisdom. And Jesus gives us an example. He says, look, yes, the fact that the color of the sky is red could be a meaningful sign, but it requires the skill of interpretation, because if it's red sky in the morning, yes, that means it's going to be stormy. But if it's red sky in the evening, that's normal. That's fine. Don't make a big deal out of it. And it strikes me that so much of what passes for political commentary in Christian circles, especially in the evangelical world, is what I would call red sky in evening scaremongering. Right? It's like taking a sign that is, look, this is just what happens in weather, okay? It's actually fine, and saying, oh my gosh, the world is about to end because the sky is red. For example, a commentator that will remain nameless, seeing a random advertisement for drag queen story hour and declaring that classical liberalism must be overturned by all means necessary and we must defeat our enemy in all-out war. And the first person we have to execute is David French. This is
the real problem here. The real
problem. I thought that was just a theoretical example. So that's an example of red sky in the evening scaremongering, right? This is not, you're blowing things out of proportion. This is part of just a normal cultural life, and instead we're turning it into the sky is falling apocalyptic ending. So this requires skill in interpreting. It requires context. It requires weighing and discernment. And this is actually why we need help in doing this, and we need to turn to wise people. And for myself, for years now, even long before we did the podcast, whenever I would think, oh, wait, the sky is red, David, you're one of the people I would turn to play weatherman, to say, like, look, how should I interpret this? Help us set some context. So that's what we're going to do today, where I want you to do that. And the good way to distinguish what you're going to do versus what you called rank punditry is, in my metaphor, would be like, we're not looking for like daily weather commentary. We're looking for climate level analysis, right? And that's what it means to pay attention to the signs of the times, and in particular, climate level analysis for Christians seeking to attend to God, seeking to pay attention to what God might be. And it's always going to be a might. We're not declaring we can know for sure, but what God might be saying through the events happening around us. So that's what we're doing today. And so let's start, David, by you actually just telling us, what did you pick out as notable from all, because there's so much of details of what happened. What did you pick out as notable?
So I have 5 things. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I have 5 things. I have 3 that are mostly good and 2 that are some bad. So I have 5 overall things, and we could literally spend an hour on any one of the 5. But so here are the 3 mostly good signs. 1, I think what we saw on Tuesday was a severe blow to what I call the malice theory of GOP politics, which is the way to win is through the closed fist more than the open hand. This is a theory that really took off in Trump's victory in 2016 and persisted through the loss of the House in 2018, the loss of the presidency and the Senate in 2020, persisted through a lot of the primaries in 2022, where the much more aggressive sort of angry MAGA candidates made it through the primary system. And then to use a term that is overused, but I'll just go ahead and use it anyway, there's been a vibe shift. I don't know how long it's going to last, but there are a lot of folks who were kind of quiet while the malice theory was prevalent, who are now sort of standing up and saying, whoa, this is not actually how you persuadable people. One of the things that was shocking in this idea that there was going to be a red wave is it appears in many, 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 many key races, Republicans lost independent voters at a time of high crime and high inflation. So number 1, blow to the malice theory of GOP politics. Number 2, blow to racial balkanization in the U.S. Now, this is something that is really important to understand, is that the GOP, even though it did not do as well as it wanted to do, continued to grow its support with more diverse voters. It had a higher percentage of the Hispanic vote. It had a higher percentage of the Black vote. It had a higher percentage of the Asian vote. The Democrats made up a lot of those losses with white college-educated voters, but the GOP is becoming more racially diverse. Why is that really important? It's really important because racial balkanization is toxic to a country and a culture. And the idea that politics has to cluster around racial identity is toxic. Right. And so this idea that you can reach people, that people can be reached through ideas and not appeals to pure identity, I think is a really good thing. Another good point, or another good development, a blow to extremism. I'm not going to say that every extremist candidate lost. But a lot did. And some of the most extreme candidates, even if they're still favored to maybe pull it out, like a Carrie Lake in Arizona or a Lauren Boebert in Colorado, are struggling mightily. And to put it in context, Carrie Lake is maybe will pull it out in Arizona, and Carrie Lake is an extreme candidate. Her predecessor, Doug Ducey, won his reelection in a Democratic wave year in 2018 by 14 points. Mm-hmm. And she might pull it out. And that's one of the quote unquote bright spots for sort of the more extreme wing of the GOP. And in a number of cases, some very endangered, much more moderate Democrats pulled out their races in a place which would show that they have perhaps the ability to put the brakes on some of the race to the extremes here in the U.S. Now, the too bad, one, we're still very calcified. And I use that term calcification. I was listening to Ezra Klein podcast from about a week ago where he interviewed some political scientists who were sort of describing the American politics. And they said our polarization is leading to calcification. In other words, there's an awful lot of people who are Republican or Democrat, and it is just absolutely in cement that they're Republican or Democrat. And you saw this in some of the races where, for example, Brian Kipp in Georgia, extremely competent governor, somebody well within the mainstream of the Republican Party, scandal-free so far as I know. And then you had Herschel Walker, who a lot of really rough scandals. And, there was only about a 5 or 6 point gap between those two, that the character issue was only able to drain about 5% or so of support from Walker. Now that might be enough to cost him a Senate seat, but there's a lot of calcification. And then the last thing is, and this is, from my pro-life perspective, the pro-life movement has lots of work to do post-Dobbs. There was just no good news for the pro-life movement on Tuesday. It turns out that abortion was the second most prominent issue in voters' minds, and of those people, more than 70% voted Democrat. Every pro-life measure on the ballot lost. Every pro-choice measure on a ballot won. The pro-choice position typically outperformed the Democratic Party. So meaning that there were crossover pro-choice Republican voters who voted in these various referenda. And we can dive more into that, but it's really clear to me as a matter of persuasion and winning hearts and minds, the pro-life movement has a giant amount of work to do. So those are my 5 things.
Okay, a lot of plays here I could pick from to run next here. Let's go with, it sounds like you're actually saying there's a kind of pattern of less racial balkanization, but more calcification. Mm-hmm. So in this tension between balkanization and calcification, I want to inject faith. Where did faith fall into this? Was there a less of a balkanization happening on faith lines, and that therefore kind of diffusing the toxic polarization, or did that calcify? Did faith calcify in terms of how Christian voters voted? And can we interpret from that what needs to happen for the church going forward?
Yeah, so this is very interesting because the exit polling when it comes to faith is often really bad. What, and this is an artifact.
So we are more in red sky in the evening.
Yeah, we're just trying to figure this all out by putting different puzzle pieces together. Okay. So here are the 2 key data points we have from exit polling, and then I will extrapolate. Okay. So if you are a white, born again, or evangelical Christian, so this is just pure self-identification. This is who I am. I'm white, and then they'll ask you, are you born again or evangelical? And that was 24% of the electorate, okay, was characterized themselves as white, born again, or evangelical Christian. Now, they said they were 83, that was 83% Republican, that vote, 83%. So that's a higher percentage than the 81% that Trump got in 2020. So 83% and 15% was the ratios, 15% Democratic, 83% Republican. Well, now there you have the modifier white. Not every born again or evangelical or church attending individual is white, right? So then you have to figure out sort of where is everybody more generally. So here's another question. How often do you attend religious services? Here's the next question. Now, this is for everybody. Once a week or more was 31% of the electorate. I don't think they're telling the truth, Curtis. I don't think
as a pastor, that's not at all surprising in terms of church attendance reporting. So
yeah, that is just not right. But 31% said they attend religious services once a week or more.
Yeah.
And of that 31%, 66% were Republican and 33% were Democratic. Of those who said they attended occasionally is 52% Republican, 47% Democrat, and never was 66% Democratic and 31% Republican. Now, how can we parse all that out? One of the ways we can parse that out is we know from other data that white Democrats tend to be extremely outlier secular they're outliers on the religious to secular spectrum. And non-white Democrats tend to be much more like white evangelical born again Republicans in their church attendance and in their attendance of religious services. So what you're seeing there is the influence of the non-white church attending Democrat is what narrows some of those margins from 83-15 to 66-33. But also there is a tension in the Democratic coalition between the extremely religious non-white part of the Democratic coalition and the extremely secular white part of the Democratic coalition. And there's a lot of evidence prior to 2022, and we'll need to get more research done. We're just days that say that, wait a minute, religious non-white Americans are in fact slowly trickling over to the Republican Party. And this is particularly true in the Hispanic community. And so one of the things that's happening, and I've written about this, is there's a God gap in American politics that the very secular white progressive base of the Democratic Party is alienating some of the more religious non-white members of the Democratic coalition. And that accounts for some of that movement from blue to red demographically. So that's a long and complicated answer, but there is.
Can I try to summarize it to see if I understand you correctly?
Yeah.
If I were to just do the dumb person's summary of what you just said, it sounds like racially, in racial terms, it's actually really good for the good of our world that we're not getting so balkanized, that there are more people of color entering the Republican Party so that it doesn't become Democrats are people of color, whites are Republicans, right? We don't want that. That's a toxic situation. So that's a good sign in terms of what the election is pointing towards anyways. But it seems like we might be heading towards balkanization religiously. It's like people of faith go to the Republicans, seculars go to the Democrats. That is bad. That is dangerous. That adds to the polarization. So we have mixed signs here. And in particular, for those of us who care especially about the church, that the church becomes a good sign in the world, a good sign of the times. The latest election results points to some work that needs to happen for those of us that don't want to see faith be a bad sign of the times.
It is still absolutely the case that both the Republican and Democratic parties depend on a church-going element of their base to win elections. So for the Democratic Party, they absolutely depend on Black Protestants to win. If Black Protestants pulled away from the Democratic coalition, the Democratic Party is kind of a rump party in the U.S. it's also absolutely true that the Republicans depend on their white evangelical church-going base. And if either one of them pulled away, both parties sort of collapse. Now, the interesting thing is the black vote is still very solidly Democratic, but it's not as solid as it was in the Obama years.
Yeah.
The big moves have happened in the Hispanic vote in the U.S. And part of that is also that the two parties and a lot of political thinkers, in my view, have tried to artificially impose race or ethnicity-based block voting identity thinking on what is, in fact, a quite diverse population.
Right.
So, Cuban Americans are different from Mexican Americans, are different from Colombian immigrants or Venezuelan immigrants. This is not sort of just one group of people, right? There are people who come from different backgrounds, different faith backgrounds. I mean, if you're coming from Brazil, Pentecostalism is incredibly vibrant in Brazil, right? And it's a different language, different culture in many ways. And so what has happened, Americans who have been sort of really focused on racial identity, I think, have artificially imposed that on a Hispanic community that doesn't necessarily see itself many times as sort of Hispanic first, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I think that's again a good thing. But that's why I said mostly good. I think it's mostly good to see the racial polarization easing. And the only reason it's not entirely good is if I don't want to see it completely replaced by religious balkanization and polarization.
And that seems like that's the work that we really need to turn to, is to how do we counter this religious balkanization? And I want to ask you, you said that you're starting to see small encouraging signs in the Republican Party to reject the malice theory or to reject sort of hyper aggressiveness. Do you see any signs in the Democratic Party to reject hyper progressivism, if you want, or hyper that them realizing, waking up, look, we're losing, just like the Republicans might need to wake up and realize we're losing voters by our hyper aggressive stance? Is there any sign Democrats are waking up and saying we're going to lose the Hispanic Catholic voter with our hyper progressivism?
Yes, and that's sort of been a slow process since 2020, because what happened in 2020 is the Democrats walked into 2020 feeling much like the Republicans did walking into 2022, which was, this is our wave, right? Mm-hmm. Trump was polling way behind. The conventional wisdom says that when the top of the ticket does well, everything's going to do well at the bottom of the ticket. And the reality was that the Democrats lost ground in the House. They lost a lot of ground in the House. And they almost, didn't take the Senate. It took sort of, Trump's wild conspiracy theories to help depress voter turnout in Georgia for them to take the Senate. Yeah. So a lot of smarter Democrats were like, whoa, wait a minute. This is after a lot of the rioting in summer of 2020, the defund the police movement, the rise of sort of hyper wokeism in elite media. And a bunch of Democrats were basically trying to slam on the brakes of that trend within the party. And you saw it both in small elections and big elections. So you had a recall of the San Francisco School Board, for example. So in the heart of San Francisco, you had progressives telling other progressives, you've gone too far. This was not a Fox News revolt in San Francisco, right?
Right.
You had a recall of a progressive prosecutor. Eric Adams wins the mayoral race in New York, and he was perceived by many folks to be the most moderate of the candidates, the sort of more serious about crime, former, New York NYPD. And so you saw a lot of signs of there that Democrats had sort of said no to, for lack of a better term, peak woke. Mm-hmm. And there were some signs that the Democrats had chosen in some of the primary contests, slightly more moderate candidates, although some of them were still not all that moderate. And where they didn't, they lost winnable races. So Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin, he was a pretty far left guy, and he almost won. I mean, he came within 1 point, but it demonstrated that there was room there for a different, and there was a Democratic governor won, in Wisconsin, even though Mandela Barnes, the Democratic nominee, lost for Senate. So there are definitely signs, and a lot of folks that I respect who really live and work in very deep blue spaces, they will say things have changed. They will say right now, this moment in 2022 is fundamentally different than it was 18 months ago.
And I want to pull back.
Ago.
I want to pull back to sort of help listeners who are Christians think about politics from a climate level analysis. Everything that another way you can interpret everything that David just said, at least from my perspective, is this is exactly why Christians ought to be defending liberal democracy. Because everything that David is just basically saying is the people are sending these sort of signs. They're sending these signals back to our elected leaders saying, you're going too far. You're going too far. They're imposing some humility on political movements that otherwise would just continue to run untrammeled in extremist and dangerous directions, either in hyper-aggressive or hyper-progressive patterns. And this is why, and we've talked about this before, this is why democracy is a humility-setting vehicle. This is why those of us who want to see our world follow the virtue of humility and reflect God's character in that way, along the Micah 6:8, sort of triad of virtues. Politics, if we adhere to democracy and defend the higher practices of democracy and care a little less about who's up and who's down in any election and just care that democracy itself is happening, it actually has a way of injecting some much needed humility to all parties, left and right, in the system.
Well, the bottom line is the angriest extremists of either party right now do not have a case to make that they've shown the way.
That's right.
And it's been messy. It's been painful to get to this point where the angriest extremists really don't have a case anymore. But here we are, which I think is a really good thing overall. Now, again, there are some storm clouds. There are some worries. The religious balkanization is one that we just raised, but the collective message of the last few election cycles has been you stampede to the extreme at profound risk to your electoral health.
So the question then is, you seem to be indicating that some political leaders, there's some small emerging signs that some political leaders on both left and right are actually properly and accurately reading the signs of the times. They're reading that, do not stampede toward the extremes. But then the question becomes, are Christians reading those signs correctly? Do you have a sign that Christian political leaders, either elected officials or political commentators in the evangelical world, are they properly picking up the signs and saying, whoa, 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 for us as, let's just say, as evangelicals, we need to really realize that we are participating in something that is just even purely on an electorally successful strategy is failing?
Talk to me about a month or two, or maybe 6 months after Trump announces.
Okay.
Because, we're on the verge. I mean, if Trump follows through on what he's strongly hinted at, that it's going to be Tuesday, the 15th, that he's going to announce his run. And I have not seen, one thing that's really critical is I have not seen a lot of the most sort of hardcore Trump supporting Christians repudiating that support at all. I have seen recriminations directed at Mitch McConnell. I've seen recriminations directed at individual candidates, but I have not seen anything moving against or towards Trump really much at all. Now, I have seen that amongst a number of commentators who I know to be Christian, but they're sort of not, they're Christians, commentators who happen to be Christian, if that makes sense. They're not, they don't lead a specific Christian constituency. And those are the people I'm most interested in, are those who lead these specific Christian constituencies. What are they going to be saying? And as of right now, it's just too early to tell. And one of the dynamics that we've seen a number of times, Curtis, is that time and again in the last 3 to 4 years, the exhausted majority has kind of waken up, stirred itself, made its will known in elections, big elections, small elections, from, the presidential election to the San Francisco recall. And then they kind of recede back. They're like, we did our job. And they go back to taking the kids to soccer practice and all of this. And the people who are in politics on a day-to-day basis lock back in all the old dysfunction really fast. Because they're the ones who are most engaged. They're the ones doing it day by day. And they are also, many of them are very dedicated to intimidation and bullying as sort of their model of engagement. Right. So, the exhausted majority will do its thing. And then 6 months later, if you're going to be looking at sort of the online discourse or the day-to-day discourse in politics, it's like the election never happened.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's the political class that's hyper engaged, still hasn't quite gotten the message.
Right. David, I want to switch to another sign that you put on the negative column, which is about the pro-life movement. Because you would have thought just, several months before, the pro-life movement would have said, we've won, right? Dobbs means we've won. But one way to interpret this as a sign of the times, the fact that, all of these local elections sort of that had pro-life elements to it pointed actually in the other direction. One way that I interpret the sign of the times is that there is a profound difference between a win that enforces your will versus a win that persuades your opponent or persuades others. There's a difference between enforcement and persuasion. So Dobbs was a win in the enforcement category, that the courts ruled from on high. There was really very little persuasion of the broader culture, the broader populace happening. In fact, it actually mobilized and kind of the reaction to that, because for a variety of dynamics. But my main point is that was not persuasion. And if you just rely on seizing the particular platforms of power so that you can enforce your particular will, you are at risk of losing the persuasion front. Is that an accurate read of the signs of the times?
I think that is accurate. And what I would do is I would say, now there are blurry lines here, but there are a couple of dynamics in play here. One is there were more anti-Roe people than there were pro-life. Okay. Now, you might say, how on earth could you be anti-Roe but not pro-life? Easy. You would say, look, Roe was just bad constitutional law. And the Supreme Court overstepped its bounds. And this is something that should be left to the democratic process. Okay. That makes you anti-Roe. And then you turn around and say to somebody, okay, so now that we have the democratic process, what's your view? Oh, ban abortion after 15 weeks. Well, that's not, most pro-life people would say, well, that still leaves in place 90+%, well over 90% of abortions. Is that pro-life? It's certainly not as extreme pro-choice, right?
Right.
And so there is a subset of people who are anti-Roe, but not fully pro-life. All right. That's one dynamic. And then here's another dynamic. The pro-life movement itself, and again, this is where lines are pretty blurry. And this is, let's just overgeneralize, the political pro-life movement versus the crisis pregnancy pro-life movement. They have different cultures. Okay, so the political pro-life movement has long been about the gaining and wielding of power.
Right. To enforce their will.
Because the pro-life, yes, because the pro-life movement is a minority movement, that has meant coalition politics, and specifically coalition politics within the GOP. The Crisis Pregnancy Center part of the pro-life movement has been focused on meeting women where they are, loving moms and babies, and trying to assist people during times of extreme stress.
In other words, to persuade people.
So you can see how the culture of both of them would be kind of moving apart from each other, especially in an era that's very for a long time in the GOP on the pro-life coalition was very Trumpian.
Right.
So the Trumpian culture is very different from the crisis pregnancy center culture. They're very different. And so what I'm worried about is that the Trumpian political culture has begun to dominate the public's perception of what the pro-life movement is. And the crisis pregnancy center culture has receded in the public's mind. The public doesn't see that as much.
Right.
And I think that's one way in which the pro-life movement is now struggling electorally. It's the political side of it is sort of like the dog that caught the car. And then the political side of it immediately fell into infighting over how strict will we be, with a big abolitionist movement, and a growing abolitionist movement saying, well, we have to criminalize women who get abortions. We have to enact blanket bans that sometimes don't even include exceptions, say, for the physical health of the mother. And those kinds of, that kind of argument was the argument that you have, in my view, Curtis, when you've already won politically and you're sort of figuring out what's the most just environment. It is not the argument you have when you haven't won politically. You haven't persuaded, in other words, a majority of the country. In fact, it's inimical to persuasion, but that's sort of my 30,000 foot diagnosis.
Another ways that we've been trying to get Christians to think about politics outside of the simplistic red versus blue category is to encourage people to pay attention to character, to the character and competence of our leaders, and not simply do they have R or D next to their names. At that high level, at the climate level, do we see any encouraging or do we see discouraging signs that voters are paying attention to character and competence? And you can answer, I suppose, with 2 words, Herschel Walker. But
yeah, I would say some encouraging, not as encouraging as I would like. So, the difference between Brian Kemp and Herschel Walker, 4 or 5 points, right?
Yeah.
Now, part of that is as a result of the fact that his own opponent is quite extreme on abortion in a pro-life state.
Herschel Walker's opponent, you mean?
Raphael Warnock is quite extreme on abortion in a very pro-life state. So that's not all on Republican voters, right? If you're a Democrat in Georgia and you want to win people over, why not move 1 inch in their direction on one of the most important issues, right?
Yeah.
So what you can't just look at Georgia; you have to sort of zoom back out. And here's where I think the picture gets more encouraging. As I said earlier, Carrie Lake might win, right? She might win. She's one of the more dangerous of, a conspiracy theorist, furious, angry, extremist politician. I think a dangerous politician, but she's gone 14 points behind the previous Republican, Doug Ducey, who's a good dude. Like he's a good guy. People may not agree with all of his politics, but he's a good dude. And a number of places you saw very known low character conspiracy theorist kinds of politicians running way behind what you might call sort of the normie politician, just the normal. And so this was the rule, not the exception. Yeah. That the low character, angry conspiracy theorist was running behind, and sometimes way behind what you would expect from a much more normal or conventional politician. I'm not even saying of sterling character. I'm just saying of in the normal character range. So I think the message overall, I mean, and as producer Chris just said, Mastriano in Pennsylvania, that was a winnable race for Republicans in what was a favorable political environment for Republicans in 2022 here. And he got blown out. He got blown out by a pretty normal and conventional Democrat. And so I do think when you zoom out from Herschel Walker in the 4 or 5 point gap there, which had other factors, as I said, and you look more broadly, you're going to see an awful lot of repudiation of, and it sometimes it's kind of tough to differentiate between who's a low character politician and repudiated on that basis versus an extremist
Yeah.
and repudiated on that basis, because often the two things, especially in the MAGA years, have gone hand in hand. But I'm not saying that every person who has sort of extreme political views has low character, just to make that clear. But in the Trump Republican Party, those two things have tended to go hand in hand.
So, David, one of the ways that I was looking at the election with an attempt in my own way to discern the signs of the times was what was happening to those candidates that very clearly denied election results, and also when those people lost, did they essentially accede to the results? Because to me, that's a climate level sign. That's a red sky in the morning sign. Is if candidates start truly refusing to concede to elections results in which they lost, because that, a fundamental underpinning of our democracy then is pulled out. That Jenga block is kind of pulled out in a very tenuous way. What did we see there? How well did election deniers fare? And then when those folks lost, did they concede?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In super red parts of the country, election deniers won. I mean, if you were nominated, if you made it through your primary in a deep red part of the country, and you were going to win your race. So let's just set that aside for a minute. If you're an election denier in a R+20 district and you won your primary, you're winning. So let's set those folks in these contested races. The election deniers have tended to do pretty poorly. Of the major Republican gubernatorial nominees who contested the election or said that they would not certify, or be more precise, refused to say they would have certified Biden's election victory in 2020, every one of them is lost except for Carrie Lake. And Carrie Lake is hanging on by her fingernails. The hardcore election denying secretaries of state in real critical election in really contested elections have tended to lose. And so far as I know, again, Carrie Lake pending, even the election denying candidates that have lost have all conceded. They've conceded their races. And I think there's a couple of things. There was a really good, I hate to say tweets are insightful, but every now and then, Benji Sarlin tweeted, he tweeted MAGA candidates everywhere are largely graciously conceding underscores how much Stop the Steal was a one-man top-down phenomenon in 2016. If Trump had conceded even begrudgingly, it wouldn't have spun out of control. It's really that simple. And I think that's exactly right. But there's another factor, and that is right-wing infotainment media is not giving airtime to the wild conspiracies. And and the contrast with 2020 is profound. Now, why would they not be giving airtime? Well, part of it is that Trump is not on the ballot, right? And the other part is a lot of them got sued for a lot of money,
right,
after 2020. Some of them are defendants in billion-dollar lawsuits right now. And I think that has had an effect. So I do think that legal boundaries can work. And you have seen some legal boundaries put around wild speculation and slander and defamation. And as has been the case, that doesn't interfere with the First Amendment. Defamation and slander, libel, they've never been protected speech under the Constitution, under the First Amendment. And enforcing those long-time norms has mattered.
Yeah. So, David, we've been talking about in a very U.S.-centric focus thus far. But when we're talking about discerning the signs of the times in terms of what is God doing and saying in the world is bigger than the U.S. And in actuality, our election results have impact beyond just our own borders even. And so I want to shift to what does this election result what might there be discerning signs for the wider world, and in particular, something you've written about and something I care a great deal about Ukraine, because what is so obviously clear, and if readers are not, our listeners are not following this very closely, they do need to pay attention to a couple things. One, Russia has declared in terms that cannot be denied that it is a regime of evil. I mean, that was already sort of clear, but their behavior has been just outright evil in terms of what you're seeing of how they are deporting Ukrainians from their own homes, separating children from their families, and actually kind of basically kidnapping them to take them back to Russia. These are all, you can read reports of this on a great website called Institute for the Study of War. I could go on. The behavior of Russia towards Ukrainians and even to its own people is just evil. And yet Ukraine is actually winning this war. Ukraine is about to seize a key strategic city of Kherson that is going to be a major victory for Ukraine that would have been just unimaginable, I think, a year ago or 6 months ago even. So why this has transpired in this remarkable accomplishment thus far, David, you've said, has been a simple combination. Ukrainian valor and American supplied weaponry has been sort of the formula here. One of the fears of this midterm election was that the results would strengthen the Republican voices that were threatening to reevaluate supply of American weaponry to Ukrainian valor. Tell us what did the midterm results tell us about what we can expect in terms of continuing support for Ukraine?
So I've got good news with an asterisk.
Okay.
So one of my big concerns, and I wrote a piece on election day that said, we need to not be saying this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Can we please stop with that? And in fact, this might be one of the less important elections of our lifetimes. Look, a change of party control in a midterm is par for the course. It's not a history-shaking event, right?
Yeah.
But I said, here's a caveat. If it is such a political transformation that it results in a cutting off of aid to Ukraine, then the U.S. midterm could have world historic implications. I think the good news is that the lack of a big wave, Republican wave, and especially the repudiation of the MAGA wing of the GOP has put this sort of foreign policy reckoning off that says, well, Marjorie Taylor Greene said, we're going to cut off Ukraine aid, right? So with this sort of hyper MAGA wing, America First wing not having a good Tuesday, I think the idea that there's some sort of American groundswell sentiment against funding Ukraine is just off the table. But here's the asterisk. Okay, here's the asterisk. The asterisk is this. If the Republicans, and it looks like they're going to get a House majority, if they get a House majority, it's going to be really small. And so that means whoever is going to run for speaker is going to feel like they've got to appease even the smallest minority parts of the GOP constituency. So does that mean that, weirdly enough, even though MAGA got repudiated in some interesting ways, that Marjorie Taylor Greene has more influence just because she and a small band of fellow travelers could block any given House Speaker candidate or call into question their the viability of their leadership? That remains to be seen. And so anytime you have a very small and tenuous majority, now, when it comes to aid to Ukraine, because Democrats, there's not been a single Democrat yet to vote against Ukraine aid. And because it appears that the anti-aid minority of the Republican caucus has not grown substantially, there's still a supermajority in the House supporting Ukraine aid. And there's almost certainly a majority of the House caucus that supports Ukraine aid. So I think for the time being, aid is, let me put it this way, bottom line, Ukraine aid is safer than it was before the election. That the results, in my view, have made it to where, and then you add to that Ukraine's military success and the argument that now's the time when we need to cut them off just makes so little sense.
Well, David, we've been talking a lot about interpreting these results kind of with a certain retrospective view of analysis. Let's turn to forecasting, which is always a dangerous game for both weathermen and for political commentators. But let's do a little bit of that. What do you think will happen next, especially at the at the climate level, at kind of the level that we're trying to care about, and its impact on the both the impact the church is making and its impact on the church? What trends do you see going forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let's do sort of short term, medium / long term. So short term, if Trump announces, it's going to change the conversation to refocus around Donald Trump again. You're going to have a big spate of polls that will start to tell you if there's any real erosion in Trump's support. It's going to really put a lot of pressure on Republican candidates to decide, do I go ahead and start declaring now? How long, or do I declare? What do I do? So a lot of that is very, I don't know, this short term, what is the dynamic that the Trump announcement, if he makes it, is going to have? And so we'll see. And then how does the Georgia election runoff come out is going to have a lot to do with sort of how Republicans end up feeling about 2022. So those things are sort of short term that I don't know. Long term, I think that the way to look at this sort of battle against illiberalism, extremism, malice is much more like World War I trench warfare than it is like, something along the lines of, Washington at Yorktown, right? Where you're going to beat the British and they're going to play the world is turned upside down, and then no, it's going to be much more like the lines move and shift slowly over time. And I think that what you're going to see is sort of a return to the political classes just furiously sniping at each other, and with a lot of really hard decisions to make. Do the Democrats run? Does Joe Biden run again? If he doesn't run again, who's the logical Democratic successor? Do people finally stand up publicly to Donald Trump? One of the things that I've been saying till I'm blue in the face is, I'll believe the tide is turning against Donald Trump when anonymous sources aren't anonymous anymore. I'm so tired of the Republican operatives are texting me and saying, well, say it out loud, Republican operatives, tweet it, write it, say it. I'll believe that the dam is really breaking when all these anonymous people who commiserate with you in the green room or call you up and say, I can't believe what he does, start doing this in public. And so I think of the sort of the fight for American decency, classical liberalism, reason is more like trench warfare than Yorktown. And so I expect that to continue.
Who should we be paying attention to going forward? Who are the figures that, as Christians, and the obvious ones in terms of just in the political sense, what will DeSantis do? That would be like an obvious one. But I'm talking about, again, at the level of the health of the church, who should be paying attention to and in a sense praying for, because what they do next could really make a difference. So for example, you just said, boy, you'll know something has broken is if a public figure publicly renounces Trump. That would be a sign of a break with the malice theory. It would be a sign of a Christian supporting democracy over partisanship. It would be a sign of the balkanization of faith. So who might be some of those Christian leaders, Christian political figures that we should be praying for and looking for some sign of hope here?
Yeah, the evangelical world is, since there's no like evangelical pope, right? And there's no real evangelical political leader who sort of commands the troops. What you're looking at, I think, is a social dynamic amongst a cluster of leaders. Mm-hmm. So, everything from Franklin Graham, who is a guy who, as leader of Samaritan's Purse, has done an enormous amount of good in the world, and also in his political voice has been, in many ways, super toxic. Somebody like that who has a big constituency, or Al Mohler, who in 2016 was against Trump, and in 2020 he's for Trump, and he says he can't see how anyone but maybe Black Christians can vote for anybody but Republicans. What does somebody like what does he do? Not that he commands legions, but he's part of this sort of peer group of leaders who have really backed Trump. And so what I'm looking at are, where do you see one or two people with big constituencies who've really waded in and endorsed Donald Trump in the past say no more. And that's what I'm looking for. Not any one specific person. I just pulled those two names out because they have big public voices and they've been pretty pro-Trump in the recent past. So I'm looking at a social dynamic more than I'm looking at an individual leader. And I want to see that social dynamic. I want to see more heterodoxy in that social dynamic than before I'm going to say that like sort of Trump's spell is broken. His spell is broken amongst the political class on Twitter, but they don't command legions.
Well, David, not only are we supposed to discern the signs of the times, but as Christians, we're supposed to also pray. And you've just talked a little about what we ought to be praying for. We ought to be praying for some courageous Christian leaders to actually stand up for principle and not just blind allegiance to Trump. But there are other ways to act. And actually, you and I are trying to act along with Russell Moore. We are launching what is just the working title of our project, the Post-Partisan Christian Project. David,
we'll think of a better title.
We'll come up with something. But that's our working title for now, Post-Partisan Christian Project. David, say more about what that project is and why it matters in this moment of our times.
Yeah. Our message is not that if you're a faithful Christian that you should be a Republican or that you should be a Democrat. Our message is much more along the lines of, not that we don't think issues are important, but that we cannot separate the what we're aiming for from the how we do it. And why can we not separate it? Because Scripture doesn't. We've talked about Micah 6:8 all the time. Act justly, love kindness, walk humbly before the Lord your God. Also, in 1 Timothy, the Lord did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power. And it's not political power, because he's writing to the New Testament church. Faith in the power of God. He did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of sound mind. And these are admonitions given to believers that in a lot of ways we just haven't translated into politics at all. And so what we're trying to do is try to say, okay, if our biblical admonition is justice, kindness, humility, love, power, faith in the power of God, love, and sound mind, what does that look like politically? How do we walk into this political world? And I think that's a completely under-discussed aspect of Christian political engagement. 9 times out of 10, if you're watching an argument about Christian political engagement, 99 times out of 100, if you're watching an argument about Christian political engagement, It's about issues. It is,
Yeah.
what should Christians believe about issue X? And it completely leaves behind, it's all about ends. It's not about means. And so a robust theology of Christian political engagement has to include means and ends. It's not just means, it's also ends. And so what's that balance?
Well, and our particular aim and strategy is to the churches. It's to the pastors. We're not trying to influence the political class with this. We are trying to actually get this content into the pews, into the small groups, into the Bible studies, into the Christian colleges and universities. And what I take from this midterm results, encouraging signs, precisely because we haven't seen outright rejection of the basic tenets of liberal democracy. The Jenga structure still stands after after this election. That's actually encouraging. That means there's room for us to talk about, okay, how then do we go back to Lincoln Logs? How can we go back to putting the right building blocks, which is what you have just described, the how of we do engage in politics. We have some breathing space and room to do that Lincoln Log work of building more solid foundations of Christian engagement in politics. And we should turn our energies to that next, as well as be praying for that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to diving in more and more and more into that project, because 2024 is coming up, and especially depending on who's ultimately running, the temperature of the United States could get very hot indeed. And Christians can be, and that we can be salt and light in that environment, or we can be kindling for the fire. Right. And we've been kerosene more than salt and light, I think, in recent years. So I think the project just gets more urgent all the time.
Well, David, you've put up an impressive stat sheet. I think you scored a triple double on this one. I've piled up some assists. I think we can call this one.
Yeah, you were feeding me in the post, Curtis, so I appreciate it. Well, yes, so thank you for hanging in there and listening to an election good faith post-mortem and pre-mortem for 2024 and beyond. And please go rate us. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. That really helps us out. Even more than ratings, subscriptions help us out. Check out Curtis's work at redeemingbabel.org. My work at thedispatch.com, and we'll be back next Saturday.